Morning, everyone. Today is Tuesday, February 26, 2019. This is the Transportation, Finance, and Policy Committee. We have 3 bills up this morning. The first bill is Senator Senjum's bill, Senate File 1622, which is a bill to transfer ownership of the Minneapolis Stone Arch Bridge back to the City of Minneapolis. And I would tell members for all 3 of the bills that are up to this morning, it would be the intention to lay them over. Senator Senjum, to your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Senate File 1622 requires the Commissioner of Transportation to transfer legal title of the James J. Hill Stone Arch Bridge to the City of Minneapolis effective July 1st, 2019. The transfer does not affect any planned repair projects on the bridge. The repair project is deemed to be a consideration for the transfer, and the section is effective the day following enactment. So, Mr. Chair and members, the Stone Arch Bridge was built between 1881 and 1883 to carry the Minneapolis Union Railroad over the Mississippi River just below St. Anthony Falls. The railroad use of the bridge ended in 1982 when it was converted to a pedestrian bridge to become part of the St. Anthony Falls Heritage Trail. On each end of the bridge, there are Minneapolis parks: the Mill Run Park and the Father Hennepin Bluff Park. In 1989, the bridge was actually bought by the Hennepin County Regional Rail Authority as part of potential light rail expansion. Representatives Rice and Sarno in 1992 sought to and were successful in having the bridge transferred to the state of Minnesota. And so today MnDOT does own that bridge. The City of Minneapolis is responsible for deck repair. So that's generally the legislative history, the background, the legislative history. Last year, MnDOT had within their request $15 million for a rehab of the St. Anthony Falls Bridge, the Stone Arch Bridge, claiming, and I'm sure this perhaps is somewhat correct, that it was deteriorating at the structural underwater part of it, and that was a concern to them. So again, $15 million was proposed. We, within the bonding purview, put $1 million into that for design and construction of a rehab. Then over the summer, MnDOT proceeded to fund it an additional $14 million into that, taking $12 million out of federal money, so-called non-traditional transportation alternative funding, and another $2 million from the Minnesota Rail Service Improvement Account. It was obviously surprising when that happened, because it was, again, done very internally without legislative purview. So the whole gist of this now is that we've got funding in place to bring that bridge up to standards, if you will, from the standpoint of repair and a future, perhaps well a 100-year future looking forward. And at this point, since it, at least in my opinion, is the middle point between 2 Minneapolis park systems, park places, that the rightful ownership of this should go back to, in this case, Minneapolis, Minnesota, as part of their park system. I don't think there's any state interests here at this point that need to be served by continuing ownership of this bridge. And I would just add, Mr. Chair, there's going to, somebody's going to say, well, we, are going to need bonding money and so on and so forth. It's been a history of at least this bonding committee to fund bridges across the Mississippi River in terms of repair and maintenance. Not so much maintenance, certainly repair. We did $31 million of the 10th Avenue Bridge last year in the bonding bill, and in other years we've done bridges over there as well. So that's the bill, to return the bridge, if you will, or give the bridge back in terms of a turn back to the City of Minneapolis, and we can have conversation.
Thank you, Senator Senjum. No one else is listed as a testifier on this bill. Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to come forward and testify either for or against the bill? Mr. Radin? Welcome, Mr. Radin. Please state your full name for the record, who you represent, and proceed with your testimony, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Eric Radin with MnDOT Government Affairs. And I would just say that, you know, the department is open to transferring the bridge to the City of Minneapolis if they would like to take the bridge. But we're kind of viewing this as a roadway turnback, although this bridge has not ever been part of the trunk highway system. You know, we do jurisdictional transfers frequently, and there's a process that we go through where either MnDOT or the local government initiates a conversation, and then we sort of enter into negotiation with the city or the county. We agree on a rehabilitation project that would be done. In this case, one is scheduled to begin construction next year. And then we talk about, you know, the ongoing sort of operational costs and maintenance costs. And then we ask for a city council resolution, and then at that point we would come forward and ask for legislation. So, you know, the legislation in this case might be a bit premature because we haven't gone through that process with the city yet. In addition, this is a little bit different than a roadway project, obviously, because a roadway typically becomes eligible for state aid funding, either on the county state aid highway system or the municipal state aid street system. And because this does not carry a public roadway, it would not be eligible for funding through either of those programs. So I have Amber Blanchard with me. She's from our bridge office if there are questions about the work that is scheduled to take place next year on the bridge. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Blanchard, welcome to the committee. Please state your full name, who you are with, and proceed with your testimony, please.
Sure. My name is Amber Blanchard.
I'm going to ask you to lean in and speak up.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Amber Blanchard with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. I am the Stone Arch Bridge Project Director. I'd be happy to take any questions related to the condition of the bridge. If there are any, the bridge does need some work. It's repairs to the mortar as well as the stone throughout the bridge, and also needs some repairs at the water line and below. We plan to install a scour monitoring system to make sure that the scour underneath or the foundations are stable, and are already starting the work as far as preliminary engineering and design.
Thank you, Ms. Blanchard. Anyone else in the audience that wishes to come forward and testify either for or against the bill? Mr. Rice. Before Mr. Rice testifies, Senator Senjum, do you want to offer any comments at this point insofar as MnDOT's testimony is concerned, or do you want to hold?
Mr. Chair, as a member of the committee, I would simply like to ask a question in terms of the past witness relative to what condition she believes the bridge will be in upon completion of the rehabilitation.
Ms. Blanchard, if you'd come forward again.
Thank you.
Ms. Blanchard, did you hear Senator Senjum's question?
I did, but could you have it repeated?
Sure. The question is simply, from your professional perspective, what condition will the bridge be in upon completion of the rehabilitation?
Sure.
Ms. Blanchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator, from my professional opinion, we actually believe that the bridge will be in good to satisfactory condition and will improve substantially and be able to not receive any work for approximately 20 years in the future.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Mr. Rice. Please state your full name, Mr. Rice. who you represent, and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Brian Rice. I'm an attorney in Minneapolis, and I'm representing the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing testimony on this. I spent most of the morning reviewing a file that's about 25 years old now. In 1994, the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board entered into agreement with MnDOT for the use of the Stone Arch Bridge as a trail system. As Senator Senjum had noted, the bridge now connects two parts of Minneapolis park system. And there was a lot of work done prior to this idea. The Stone Arch Bridge, as Senator Senjum said, was completed in 1883, and almost 100 years later it was closed. But there was a period of about 10 years where the bridge stayed empty, started to deteriorate, and there were literally trees growing on the Stone Arch Bridge. Pretty big trees, as a matter of fact. And there was an effort that, as Senator Senjum said, the County Regional Railroad Authority acquired the bridge from BN Great Northern in the late 80s, and there was an effort to say, how can you keep this resource in some condition? The bridge is a historic civil engineering landmark nationally. It's also on the National Registry of Historic Places. So it's a very important asset to the state. I would say it's iconic. Mr. Hill was known as the Empire Builder, and he certainly built this state. The state owns the James J. Hill building, and this is another structure of Mr. Hill that's currently an asset of the state. It serves the park that it's located in, has over 2.7 million user visitors. It's the third largest regional park. It's one of the designated parks by the Met Council under state law as a regional park. It's the third most used regional park in the entire metropolitan area. The first is the Chain of Lakes at 8 million, Como Park in St. Paul, which we all know has 5 million, and this is the third largest user. So we estimate there's at least 2 million people who traverse this bridge every year. It gets a lot of traffic, bicycle, pedestrian. It's a main link between the University of Minnesota and downtown for students and other commuters. And it's, as noted again by Senator Senjum, it's on right over the Falls of St. Anthony, and becomes a major viewing point. So the agreement that we had was for 50 years in '94. We're halfway through it. The original repairs that were done when the bridge was taken over was under ICE-T. It was an 80-20 grant. $2.1 million was secured by Congressman Sabo in 93 or 94 for the repair and replenish or repair of the bridge when it was transferred to a bridge use. There was about $500,000 that came in a match from the City of Minneapolis, the Park Board, and the St. Anthony Falls Historic Board, which is a entity that comprised of the Historical Society, Hennepin County, Minneapolis Park Board, and some other agents. Ms. Cerny from the City of Minneapolis here can speak to some of the repairs. We believe that the Park Board is responsible for the maintenance of this bridge currently, and our best estimate is we're spending approximately $50,000 a year to maintain the surface of the bridge, the pedestrian part. The Park Board has a easement over the top of the bridge and has to do the railings, the lighting, the drains on the top. MnDOT is responsible for the structural integrity of the bridge. I know this is a big issue, but it is an icon. When you watch the Super Bowl or any Vikings game, you're going to see that picture. It's who we are as Minnesotans. We can appreciate the committee's concern about this asset. If the bridge were transferred back to the Park Board, we'd estimate the whole cost, if you had to do a complete replace that bridge, or like the state capitol, where you spent $330 million. I believe what this engineer is saying about it making structurally, but if something were to happen to that bridge and the floods of '65, 2 piers went out. If there was a major structural collapse of that bridge, you'd have to take 2 or 3 years of the park board's entire budget to replace it. If you even gave it to the city of Minneapolis, which is 10 times the size of the park board, it would be a major expense to them. If you give it back to Hennepin County that had it before, MnDOT had it. I know the committee probably doesn't want to hear this, but the only real guarantor of whether that bridge is going to be here 130 years from now is probably the state of Minnesota. And quite frankly, I think it's given its historic significance in crossing the river, opening up the northwestern part of the state, and the BN traffic system that's why the Historical Society, there's another agreement besides the use agreement with MnDOT. There's also an agreement between the local governments and the Historical Society for how this property is treated going on. So I appreciate that the bill will be laid over, but if the bill is going to get further consideration, I think there's a lot of history that needs to be understood before the committee would move with the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Would you state your full name, please? Welcome to the committee, who you represent, and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Senators. My name is Lisa Cerny. I'm the city engineer.
Could you spell your last name for us?
Yep, Lisa Cerney. I am the city engineer, deputy director of public works.
Thank you.
So I'm here today to testify that the city is uncomfortable at this point in time with a turnback. We just learned about this over the weekend and have not had sufficient conversations. As MnDOT stated, typical turnback processes require opportunities for us to have a conversation, to understand condition, understand future obligations for funding, both for the short-term maintenance but also for a potential replacement cost. So at this point in time, I'll simply just state we are uncomfortable with a turnback. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in the audience wants to testify? Seeing none, we will go to member questions. Senator Dibble.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair. If the testifiers could stay, I have a question for Ms. Cerny. Mr. Chair, Ms. Cerny, can you describe a little bit, I think Mr. Rice talked a little bit about some of the park board responsibilities. What are the present responsibilities that the city has with respect to the bridge?
Senator, committee members, today the City of Minneapolis Public Works responsibility is solely for the lighting and really the decorative lighting on the underneath side of the arches. Several years ago, there was a fundraising, private funding opportunity that the city received funding to install the decorative lighting and have enough maintenance costs to perform the operation and maintenance of that lighting. That's the only responsibility that we have.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, to Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice, did you say that prior to the state owning the bridge, the county or the regional rail authority, which is a subsidiary, if you will, or a creature of the county, owned the bridge, and they're the ones who took ownership from the Burlington Northern?
Mr. Rice.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Dibble, yes, that's correct. I believe Senator Senjum also pointed that fact out.
Okay.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you. Senator Senjum uses the term revert to the ownership of the city. I don't think the city has ever owned the Stone Arch Bridge, Mr. Chair. So if I could ask Senator Senjum a question. Senator Senjum, have you asked the city of Minneapolis if they'd like to take ownership of the bridge? Have you spoken to me about this bill? And you mentioned that this was being introduced last week and being heard today as a senator from Minneapolis who serves on this committee.
Senator, Mr. Chair and Senator Dibble, no, I have not done either one of those. This, I think, hearing was intended to fulfill that obligation. I'm pretty sure we're going to lay this bill over, so there's a long time going forward, I suspect, before we get to an omnibus bill to have that conversation.
Senator Dibble.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to have the A1 and the A2 amendments distributed.
Senator Dibble, which amendment do you wish to offer first?
Mr. Chair, I'm not going to move either one of them. I'm just making a point. You know, you know, obviously the point I'm making is that we all have facilities that are owned by the state in our districts, which may or may not be a good idea to turn back to local jurisdiction. In A2 in particular, these are 3 bridges that are just about to be repaired in Senator Senjum's district. You know, maybe it's a good idea for, you know, maybe, you know, the state shouldn't take on that responsibility after they get repaired and they should be owned by Milton. I don't know. We could have that conversation. Maybe there are stretches of state facilities that are, you know, maybe used by folks from those local jurisdictions, but probably, given that they're trunk highway, they're used by a lot of people from a lot of other places. You know, but maybe I don't feel like paying my tax dollars to, on an ongoing basis, maintain those facilities, whether or not I drive occasionally on Trunk Highway 238 or Trunk Highway 55 or Trunk Highway 7. Mr. Chair, you heard Mr. Rice talk about the fact that the Central Riverfront is part of the regional park system, which is basically the metro area's state park system, supported in large measure, but somewhat a little bit from state resources, but for the most part from a lot of the resources that are generated in the metro, regardless of which jurisdiction they're in. The regional park system, if you recall, is 10 different park agencies, local park agencies in the metro that dedicate a portion of their park system because of the volume and the nature of the visitors to those parts of the park system become a de facto part of the regional park system. We forego, for the most part, with the exception of the Minnesota River Valley, any presence of a state park system in the metro. And when 2.7 million people are visiting a fairly small area, and estimated 2 million people cross over that bridge, which is a major transportation facility, not just a recreational facility, between downtown and major generators of activity, whether that's employment or education or the like. That's a pretty important transportation connection that serves a lot of people who don't live in Minneapolis. If maybe Minneapolis was forced to own the bridge, maybe we can check people's IDs when they cross over the bridge and make sure they live and pay taxes in Minneapolis. Maybe we can consider that amendment. But I'm a little surprised to see a bill like this show up over the weekend with no phone calls being made to anyone at the City of Minneapolis about what they think about that idea. I just don't think that's the way we treat each other in the Senate, Mr. Chair.
Senator Dibble, thank you for your comments. Perhaps if MnDOT had not conducted themselves in the manner that they did in finding the funding to do the repairs for this bridge, we would not find ourselves in this position today. As Senator Senjum indicated, the Capital Investment Committee said no to MnDOT when their request came to that committee for purposes of these repairs. And after the Capital Investment Committee said no, MnDOT unilaterally on its own went out and found the funding in order to make the repairs. And I maintain that MnDOT is not an autonomous entity. I maintain that the legislature does in fact have a role to play in how money is to be spent. And so perhaps, Senator Dibble, you feel as though you have been left out of the loop on this, and I will tell you that I feel pretty well left out of the loop on the manner in which MnDOT conducted themselves. To further the problem, the source of the money, while the federal money that they came up with I can understand, but they went into the Mercy account and took money out of the Mercy account to fund this. Now, in my mind, the Mercy account is there to help fund and help our railroads. Legally, I've looked at the statute. I think the statute candidly is poorly written, and I don't think that MnDOT did anything illegal in terms of raiding the Mercy account, but I sincerely believe that they were wrong in doing so, because the Mercy account there is to help these railroads function as a business. And why they went into that Mercy account, I don't know, and why they didn't tell us. It's simply, you know, in my mind, they complain about us earmarking things. That's precisely what they did in this case. They earmarked it and went out and found the money and never told us about it. So I do think, Senator Dibble, that there are two sides to the story here, and one of the reasons why this bill is coming forward is not the fault of the City of Minneapolis and not the fault of the Park Board. It's the way MnDOT conducted themselves in handling this thing without ever consulting us after we turned them down. Senator Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to that point, I don't know if it's Mr. Rudin or Ms. Blanchard would like to answer the question, but I'd like to know when they found out that the federal funds were available for this bridge. Was it before or after the bonding request, and at what date that these funds were found out they were available from the federal non-traditional transportation alternative fund?
Mr. Rudin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Howe. So the department has been asking, I'm trying to find the sheet of paper I had, but the first time we requested funding to repair the bridge was in 2014.
And I don't need a history lesson on when the funds were requested, and we're just wondering when these funds became available and when you became aware of these funds. Thank you.
Mr. Rudin.
Mr. Chair and Senator Howe, after the last legislative session ended, when we had requested a significantly higher amount of bond funds and then received only $1 million, we did an analysis to determine kind of where we were with the bridge, and we were getting very concerned about the condition of the bridge. And so given the history of our unsuccessful requests of funding to repair the bridge at the legislature, we then started exploring other alternatives to come up with the funds. And so it was really after last legislative session ended that we did that analysis. I would say that, you know, the funds had been available. It's a bike ped facility. These transportation alternative funds can be used for bike ped facilities, but the decision was made last summer into the fall, in September, to move forward with this option because we weren't frankly confident that another legislative request would be successful.
Senator Hull.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so, knowing that this is for non-traditional alternatives, what other projects would have been available for these funds? Would be the project in my district, Corey Trail, been available for these funds?
Mr. Rudin.
Mr. Chair and Senator Howe, the Federal Transportation Alternatives Program does fund bicycle pedestrian projects that are adjacent to highways, both on the state trunk highway system and on the local road system. So I don't know if we have a specific list of projects, you know, that will have to wait an additional year or two to receive funding, but I can see if we can get that for you.
Senator Howe.
Thank you. I'd love to know how many projects got put on hold because you determined what project was the most important instead of getting the funding through the Transportation Committee and having a discussion on what should be done. I'm a little disappointed that you decided that this was the project to use these funds for, and other projects throughout the state all got held up. Now, the other question I got is about the Mercy funds. What other projects that these funds from the Mercy Fund could have been used for and all now get delayed or possibly overlooked because we decided to take $3 million out of the Mercy Fund account?
Mr. Rudin.
Mr. Chair and Senator Howe, typically we do a solicitation when Mercy funds are available. In this case, there was some money that was being held for Page and Hill cleanup in northern Minnesota on a rail bank, and those funds had been sitting there for, I believe, 4 or 6 years, something like that. It's been a while, and so rather than continue to hold those funds, the decision was made to release those funds and use them in this project. But there was an announcement last fall, because there was a small amount of money in the bonding bill last year for the Mercy program, and so we did a solicitation and we funded some projects with the money that was in the bonding bill plus other funds that were previously available in the Mercy account.
You done, Senator?
No, I'm not.
Senator Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Redeen, so were there no other projects available to use these funds, or were some projects turned down? And could you provide us a list of those projects that were turned down because these $3 million went to this project?
Mr. Redeen.
Mr. Chair and Senator Howe, yes, I believe that when we did the solicitation last year for Mercy, there were more requests than were awarded, so I can get you that list.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And Mr. Redeen, am I correct that after the $2 million was taken out of the Mercy Fund for this particular project, there was $935,000 remaining?
Mr. Chair, let me see if I have
The information that I have, Mr. Redeen, from MnDOT reflects a balance after the $2 million being taken out for the Stone Arch Bridge, $935,000 available balance. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, I believe that's correct. I think that was, actually that would have been the balance prior to the funds going to this project. Are you looking at the fact sheet, Mr. Chair? That was, this was prepared last fall when the decision was made to use these funds. So,
well, I don't see a date on this, Mr. Redeen, but it's a Minnesota Department of Transportation Stone Arch Bridge funding proposal, and on the back side, it
So, yeah, Mr. Chair, I think that was the available balance that was sort of unspent in the account as of last
Thank you,
fall.
Mr. Redeen. Senator Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Redeen, can you confirm with me that the project that you took this money from is now really in the governor's request, in his bonding request, that now he's requesting the same funds back again in the bonding? Is that true?
Mr. Redeen.
Mr. Chair, Senator Howe, yes, that's correct. There is still a need to do cleanup at the Page and Hill site, but the Department of Agriculture is actually in charge of that process. And, you know, there's no project that's imminent, but we do know that there's a future need to do cleanup at that site.
Senator Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Senator Senjum, I actually have a question for these testifiers from the Park Board and the city, if they're still present. A newcomer's question regarding governance, Senator Senjum. If this bill was to become law and the Stone Arch Bridge was turned back, could a future park board or city council of Minneapolis then choose to close traffic on the bridge, you know, at their discretion? Could they choose to redecorate, redesign, or destroy parts of the bridge at their leisure?
Senator Senjum.
Mr. Chair and Senator Klein, to the extent I can answer that, I'll try. It is on the National Registry, and so there are going to be some restrictions there, but I think quite possibly, sure. It's they have if City of Minneapolis has governing authority, they could probably close that bridge if they wanted to. I don't know why they'd want to. We're not here to destroy the bridge. It's iconic. It's all good. It is, you know, in every Super Bowl centerfold you might find, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not about that. It's just about governance and who, in my mind, ought to own it, given the fact that it does connect to Minneapolis parks. and the state of Minnesota right now owns it. That, does that make sense? It doesn't to me.
Senator Klein?
But again, I agree with you. It is iconic, and we're not talking about closing the park, but we would be ceding that authority. And somebody could certainly close traffic on that park. A future park board or city council could make that decision. Mr. Chairman, I just want to make a quick comment, and I actually respect the fact that you are defending the power of the purse at the legislature, and I think that is a reasonable assertion on which I support you. That said, this bill seems to arise from a bit of rancor, which I don't think is the basis for how we should manage our state assets. And I hope in your discretion going forward that you're laying this on the table, point made, and that we won't use our tremendous Stone Arch Bridge as a bargaining chip between the legislature and the executive. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klein. Senator Friends.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start by thanking Senator Howell. The question before the committee should be our oversight of MnDOT. I think that's an appropriate function of the Transportation Committee, and we can ask any questions that we want. I think that's proper. I don't think it's proper to do this with the City of Minneapolis or the Parks Board without consulting them. And I guess my point for the committee would be, it's one thing to say we decided not to fund the bridge. That's fine. That's the power of the purse. It's another thing to say we have oversight of MnDOT. We clearly do, and it's a responsibility that we hold dear. It's quite another to say to the City of Minneapolis, hey, you're getting this bridge. I know I didn't tell you about it, but here it comes. And so for that reason, I'd ask the committee members to keep in our lane, which is that we have oversight of MnDOT. That's one thing. And if we didn't support funding of the iconic state asset, that's another. And I think we do better for the people of Minnesota by keeping to the task that the committee gives us. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And thank you, Senator Friends, for those comments, because I do agree with you. And I suspect that had MnDOT come to this committee and discussed with us what their intentions were, we could have had a discussion regarding the appropriations to fix the Stone Arch Bridge, but they didn't do that. And so today we are taking the opportunity to have that very discussion that we didn't have the opportunity to have in the past when MnDOT took the action that it did. I've already indicated I'm not in any way being critical of the City of Minneapolis or the Park Board. They are absolutely welcome to come forward and testify and give us their side of this story, and that's really the whole purpose of having the hearing today. It's unfortunately that we should have had this hearing prior to the actions taken by MnDOT.
Mr. Chair?
Senator Senjum.
I just want to comment too, unless there be any misunderstanding. We had a conversation with MnDOT. I do recall Senator Dietzig was there. I think you were there, Mr. Chairman. Towards the very end of session, and we did put $1 million into this last year's bonding bill for design and engineering. You don't do that unless you anticipate at a future time that, in fact, you're going to take care of the needs of that bridge. We started out with design and engineering. It wasn't any way to turn our back on this bridge. We did not fund it. We didn't, frankly, at that point in time, have another $14 million to do that. Or, frankly, we probably didn't even know the amount it was going to cost. But we did enter into a journey, if you will, to go ahead and fund this bridge ultimately. And so let's not forget that. I mean, once we get $1 million invested in something, I don't think we're going to turn our back on it going forward.
And Senator Senjum, I do recall that conversation during the request from MnDOT in the Capital Investment Committee.
Mr. Chair, I would also, and this is, what's believable, and nobody around here lies, I don't think, but I mean, we were presented with the situation that the Stone Arch Bridge was going to fall into the river. I frankly found that if you look at the structure of that thing, the underpinnings would have to be awfully bad, I believe, maybe even beyond reasonable repair, if that was the case at that point last May of 2018. So again, we proceeded with the idea that we're going to, in an orderly fashion, present them $1 million to move forward on design and engineering, and with the idea that, yes, we would go forward with rehabbing this bridge. And now, Mr. Chair, that it is going to be rehabbed. Once again, I think the conversation with respect to ownership is an appropriate one.
And if I understood the testimony correctly, after it's rehabbed, it would not require any more work. I think it was for 20 years. So it would seem to me that the state has fulfilled its obligation. Senator Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With regard to this discussion, I want to echo very much what Senators Klein and Senator Frentz said. I mean, we definitely have an obligation in terms of our oversight of state agencies and MnDOT and in our role of funding state government. But I do want to say I think that my two greatest concerns about this bill are if we have a frustration with how MnDOT handled things, I think this is and we want to assign consequences. I think we need to assign consequences appropriately, and the way this is handled and the way this drags Minneapolis and this particular asset into the conversation, I think, is misdirected in that regard. And I would just say, and I think Senator Dibble's drafts of amendments that were distributed make the point really clearly. This is a pretty unfortunate precedent I think we would be setting if we went forward with this. And I think all of us in our own communities, recognize that these types of decisions are significant. They have significant consequences, and I believe they deserve a much more thoroughly thought out discussion if we were going to reassign assets like this. But that said, let's keep having the conversation about the oversight aspect.
Thank you, Senator Kent. I see no other questions from any members. Final thoughts, Senator Senjum.
Mr. Chair and members, you've heard the bill. I guess at this point it was going to be set aside for future offline
if I may
conversations.
interrupt you, Senator Senjum.
Yes.
Senator Hall has just indicated he has a question, and I want to give you the final word.
Sure.
I apologize, but I was thinking that we were on these two bills, two amendments. No?
We are not.
We put those aside?
They were drafted by Senator Dibble for illustrative purposes only.
Gotcha.
We're not
okay,
off.
I apologize.
Senator Senjum.
Well, Mr. Chair, I would just simply, as a member, move that this Senate file, 1622, be set aside for future consideration with respect to possible inclusion.
Thank you, Senator Senjum. Senate File 1622 is laid over. Next up is Senator Jasinski's bill, Senate File 1511. Senator Jasinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe this bill is much less controversial and much more exciting, actually, than the last one. Senate File 1511 makes a minor adjustment to the state regulations on the colors used for school buses. This change was included in last year's vetoed supplemental budget bill. I'm bringing back in hopes that we can get taken care of this year. I am joined today by Scott McMahon with the Minnesota School Bus Operators Association, who can provide additional details on this bill. I also want to note this bill has the support of the Office of Pupil Transportation Safety, and Lieutenant Rayo from the Office is here and can testify if anyone has any questions for the agency. With that, I'll turn it over to my testifier.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. McMahon, if you would state your full name, please, who you represent, and proceed.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. My name is Scott McMahon. I'm with the firm Flaherty & Hood here today on behalf of the Minnesota School Bus Operators Association. They are the collection of the private companies that contract with school districts to safely and effectively transport kids to and from school on a daily basis across the state. This is a bill, as the Senator mentioned, that was passed and included in the vetoed omnibus bill last year. We brought it back in hopes that we can get it passed and across the governor's desk this year. It does one very simple change. You should have in your packets today a picture of a school bus that outlines the parts of the bus we're talking about. Under current statute, the belt line of a bus can be either black or yellow with yellow or black writing if it's there. That's the part that's in the middle of the bus there, represented with the arrow. The rub rails are the black lines you see on a bus. They are there for structural, to help with the safety of the bus in the case of an impact. The coloring of them has nothing to do with safety. It only has to do with the cosmetic appearance of the bus. What this bill is asking us to do is to allow the belt line immediately above that wording section or immediately below that wording section to either be black or yellow. The reason we're asking this is there are a handful of bus operators in some of the rural parts of the state that are not in compliance with the color regulations. This bill would bring all bus companies in the state into compliance with the coloring that needs to be there. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks may have.
Anyone else in the audience that wishes to testify either for or against the bill? Seeing none, Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I missed this last year. I don't remember this conversation. To the testifier, you say that, okay, so the rub rails are basically those elements that provide greater structural support for the bus in the case of an accident. And the fact that they're painted black has nothing to do with safety. It's just an aesthetic matter. Why is it a function of law then? Who cares in that case? And the reason I ask is because it would seem to me that it's in law because it does have something to do with the visibility of the bus. Is that not true? Is that not accurate?
Mr. Chairman and Senator, yes, the colorations of the bus are specific in state law. We want our buses to be black and yellow. Everybody knows that school buses are black and yellow. We have various parts of the buses that are laid out in state statute as to what parts are yellow, what parts are black. But in the total collection of them, you will always see a black and yellow school bus. There isn't a safety component built into necessarily what portions of them are black and what portions of them are yellow. We just know that we want them to be those colors so that people, when they see a school bus, they know it's a school bus.
I see that law enforcement came wandering down the aisle. Do you wish to come forward and testify on this issue?
Sure.
Welcome to the committee. Please state your name in full, who you represent, and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Chair. Lieutenant Brian Rue, Minnesota State Patrol, specifically Office of Pupil Transportation. The testifier did answer the question fairly well, that the reason that the rub rails are required to be black in existing law is just for the identification purposes of the school bus. There's a bit of an oversight, I guess I'd say, on the fact that when the belt line is black, and when you add the rub rails above and below to also be black, it adds significant amount of black to the school bus. So that's where these contractors that use the black belt line would prefer to have the yellow above and below just to provide that contrast, but maintaining the consistency of the black and yellow school bus.
Senator Dibble, you have any follow-up?
Mr. Chair, I guess I don't actually care that much. It makes sense that, like if the belt line is black, then the rub rails should be yellow, and vice versa. I do think it adds the kind of visual contrast to improve, the visibility of the bus to other motorists. But if the experts say it doesn't matter, who am I to say it does? Thanks.
Senator Carlson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I have just a curiosity question. I think that there is some advantage to having some contrasting colors for people to view that there's the side of this huge vehicle that is maybe crossing in front of them. And I'm wondering if in another place of law where it's not covering colors, is there a requirement of the side marker lights? And also perhaps even some it looks like on this bus there's no reflective surfaces all the way from the front to the back. And we do require reflective surfaces on, or let's say reflective warnings on semi-trailers, where a person that is encountering the vehicle from the side would know that this is a long vehicle, and there would be reflective lights that would show to them when they approach the vehicle from the side. And I see there's a small dot in the the rear of this bus. I don't know if that's a reflector or if that's actually a lit light, but these days side marker lights tend to be more important, and I think more and more auto manufacturers at least are putting them on sides of their vehicles.
Mr. McMahon, officer.
Thank you, Chair, Senator, and members. Minnesota adopts the National School Bus Design Standards, which are put in place by representatives from all 50 states, and they update these standards every 5 years. Along with that, school buses are required to be equipped with reflective tape along the side. It's a little bit difficult. It is yellow reflective tape, so that if you're looking at the bottom 3 rub rails, there's the middle one. Just above it, there is a about a 2.5 to 2 3/4 inch strip of reflective tape there that goes from the entrance door all the way back to the rear of the bus, or to within a foot of the rear of the bus. You're right, there is a reflector on that lower left corner of the bus as you're looking at it from the side, and there's also another one about halfway up, a little bit in front of the rear wheel. Those are just reflectors. There's the side turn signal light behind the door as well for that would go when the hazard lights are on, or the turn signals. We do follow the national specifications for design standards. They do not get into the specificness of what colors rub rails need to be, so that is a state-specific choice. Some states have the entire bus is yellow, all their rub rails are yellow. Minnesota chooses to have that contrast just for different lighting circumstances.
Senator Carlson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I guess I need to make sure that this has nothing to do with my former employer, 3M. It makes reflective materials.
I think that was a joke. Any other questions from any of the members? Seeing none, Senator Jasinski, any final thoughts before we lay the bill over?
No, Mr. Chairman, just thank you for hearing the bill.
With that, Senate File 1511 is laid over. Final bill of the morning would be Senator Osmick's bill, Senate File 1148.
Don't you hate it when you have your cell phone not on silent?
Senator Osmick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senate File 1148 is a fairly short, very simple bill stating that the Minnesota legislature and the taxpayers of the state of Minnesota will not be held accountable or responsible for any additional funding for light rail projects in Minnesota. This is very similar to the bill that we had, I believe, in the last biennium, stating that Southwest Light Rail would not be funded by the taxpayers. The legislature does not have any ability to chime in whether they believe or do not believe that the project makes financial sense for Minnesotans. This bill simply takes Minnesotans off the hook. If these light rail lines want to be built, they certainly can be by counties. There's nothing that prohibits that. But this just simply says if the legislature is not going to have the ability to say yes or no to these projects, that we are not going to be putting the taxpayers on the hook. And with that, I will answer any questions. It's a fairly simple and straightforward bill.
Anyone in the audience wishes to come forward and testify for or against the bill?
My shadow is here. Mr. Shetland is my shadow.
Welcome to the committee. Please state your name in full and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Stephen Huser, and I represent Metro Cities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on Senator Osmick's bill, Senate File 1148. Metro Cities policies support all modes of transit, including light rail, with support from the state, federal, and local levels of government, and recognizes the importance of a broad range of transportation and transit options that play a role in a strong economy, region, and state. Metro Cities respectfully oppose the Senate File 1148, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Shetland, please come forward. State your name in full and who you represent, and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Judd Shetland. I'm the Government Affairs Director at the Metropolitan Council and appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak to Senate File 1148. The Council does not support Senator Osmick's bill. The impacts in the short range are very minimal. He does exempt the operations for the current Green Line and current Blue Line operations. As he mentioned earlier in his testimony, that the Southwest Line has already this language that does not allow the state to pay the 50% operating share. By extending this to the to future light rail lines, it does impact the Bottineau light rail line, which is in our plan for our long-range transitway plan. And we have concerns about the fact that the way that we have planned for that, for the capital and operating for that project, this would seriously impact that, because he leaves he just says that the state will not pay for that. So it is uncertain where the other operating costs will come from. And I would just add that if the idea would be to have that be covered by the counties, I think it would seriously impact what the council's, the county's impacts were, or rationale was for levying the additional sales tax. And they have their plans and how they're going to do that, and I feel fairly certain that it wasn't in order to backfill what statutory or what state statute requires the state to pay that 50% share. So while there isn't a short-term impact, I think the long-term impacts of this bill are pretty major, and I just want to make sure that we had an opportunity to voice our opposition to that.
Thank you, Mr. Shetland. Any other testifiers in the room that wish to testify for or against the bill? Seeing none, we can go to Mr. Shetland, could you come back? Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure if I heard Mr. Shetland right or not. I think I know the answer to this question, but he's so articulate and silver-tongued that it went fast. Would this affect the operations for the Green Line extension, the Southwest LRT?
Mr. Shetland.
Mr. Chair and Senator Dibble, it would not. That legislation that was passed in 2017 is in existence. I think what Senator Osmick is doing is trying to extend that to future light rail lines, which, as I was mentioning, that would apply to the Bottineau line in particular. And my comment was that what this language does here is that it leaves it ambiguous of where that 50% former state share would be paid, and that would create issues for us as we move forward in the process of trying to secure a full funding grant agreement for that. And if the idea was to have the counties pay for that, which is not mentioned here, it would impact what I believe their plans are for their locally imposed sales tax for transit investment.
Thank you.
Senator Dibble?
Yeah, thank you.
Senator Lang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad you stayed up here for just a second. You said there was a 50-50 split. I'm guessing the Metropolitan Council pays for half and the state pays for half. Is that how it's funded?
Mr. Shetland.
Mr. Chair and Senator, actually the state share is the Met Council share. The other 50% share comes from the county. And so just to give you a little bit of background, in 2017, the state share for Southwest LRT was going to be 50%, and then the county was going to pay 50%. In the budget agreement, it said that the state will not pay that 50%, and so Hennepin County is now having to pay 100%.
What is that
Senator
cost?
Lang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What is that dollar figure?
Mr. Shetland.
I'm sorry, I missed.
What's the dollar figure you're talking about?
Mr. Chair and Senator Lang, I think it is close to $30 million or so a year, probably a little bit more than that.
Senator Lang.
After fares, excuse me.
Okay, that's my next question. What percentage of that $30 million is fares?
Mr. Shetland.
Mr. Chair and Senator Lang, the line isn't operating just yet.
For the existing?
But based off of previous, or the Green Line and Blue Line, we think that the the fare recovery is in the 30 to 35 to 40% range. It's the fare recovery for light rail is amongst the highest in our system.
Senator Lang.
Okay, so you're talking $6 to $8, $9 million, give or take.
Mr. Shetman?
Mr. Chair, Senator Lang, if I could, I'd like to follow up with that with you. I don't like giving you numbers that I'm just having to come off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to show you what the percentage of the fare revenue is part of the overall operating costs.
Is that transit? Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is that transit wide, or is that trains versus buses?
Mr. Shetman.
Mr. Chair and members, the fare recovery and per passenger subsidy is different for all the different types of service that we have. The per passenger subsidy for light rail is actually the best we have on our system. And I've been to the committee before talking about the other side of our system, which is Metro Mobility, where that is incredibly high. And then we have the North Star line, the regular route bus, arterial BRT. All of those have different ranges of what I think the average fare recovery would be and the per passenger subsidy. But I can certainly provide that to the committee.
Thank you. Senator Lang.
No, that's all I had.
Any other questions by members? Senator Franzen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Senator Osmek, you mentioned in line 1.15, and also it's referenced in 1.22, certain number of counties. Why are those specific to your bill, and have they been consulted?
Senator Osmek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Franzen, no, they have not been consulted. The referenced counties are from the 7-county metro area that would be previously part of CTIB. If everybody remembers, I believe we dissolved CTIB, in my opinion, in probably not a logical way, but nonetheless, they were the counties of CTIB, so hence I wanted to stay with the same county package. I'm sure that Senator Anderson would enjoy me including Wright County, but I think he wants me to keep them out of this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And
one moment, Senator Franzen, please. I'm going to call on Ms. Stengel. Maybe can answer that question, Senator Franzen, and I'll come back to you. Ms. Stengel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. You'll see the same list of counties on line 216 and 222, and basically you'll see it in any Met Council bill we have. It's a drafting thing, that when you're applying something, in this case, it's the Met Council in 473, you have to state the application to whichever counties or whichever portion of the state it is. So all the Met County bills are going to have the same list of counties afterwards.
Senator Franzen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Osmek. I do suggest that the author actually consult with these counties, because the cost of some of the projects that are in the pipeline, like Botno, has been worked on for decades, literally. So there's certain investment, and I know businesses have also been at the table, and stakeholders that are kind of counting on that avenue to move workers. So that's one thought. And then the other question I have regarding the drafting, it strikes on line 2.8 through 2.10, the reference to new starts. So just to understand, and maybe Ms. Stengel can talk about it, or maybe the author can, why that's stricken, and does that mean that we are no longer to accept any new starts money? Is that the intent of the legislation, Senator Osmek?
Ms. Stengel can certainly chime in, but Mr. Chair, Senator Franzen, I think that the reason for the striking of that is because it really doesn't have the New Starts is already a program, and there's a timeline on it, and I think it's superfluous. It doesn't necessarily need to be in there any longer. So Ms. Stengel, maybe you can.
I'm going to ask Ms. Stengel to weigh in on that question also. Senator Franzen. Ms. Stengel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. As both Senator Osmek and Mr. Shetman has identified, current law prohibits the state from paying 50% for the Southwest Light Rail, and the language you see here identifies Southwest Light Rail without actually naming it. So if you read the whole thing, it talks about a segment of rail that was part of the New Starts program during that date, and when you put that all together, that means Southwest Light Rail. So that is now redundant, because earlier in that same paragraph you have anything after July 1, 2019, which would be Southwest Botno, and anything in the future from there.
Thank you,
Senator Franzen.
Mr. Chair and Council. My question remains to the author, to Senator Osmek, because the New Starts program is basically how states afford to do these types of projects. So if we're actually not allowing for new projects to come. We're basically leaving money on the table in the federal government from that program. So are you intentionally trying to avoid recouping those costs for transit programs or projects like this one? Is that the intent of the legislation, that we have no other way to leverage those dollars and bring them back to Minnesota?
Senator Osmek?
Well, Mr. Chair, Senator Franzen, I consider that somewhat of a bring home the bacon kind of question. I think light rail projects should actually make sense. They don't in Minnesota. They do in other cities. And by quote unquote leaving our money in Washington doesn't necessarily mean that we're not receiving it in other directions and other mechanisms. I just don't see this as a mode of transportation that makes the tiniest bit of sense based upon the cost of build-out, which is $2 billion. I am at this point trying to tell the federal government, don't give us money for these additional lines.
Mr. Chair, and I guess, Mr. Shetland, can you perhaps, practically speaking, let us understand how that would work? If this legislation moved forward, we couldn't leverage, this is what I assume, because these are costly projects, and that's why we have a federal partner, and how we fund our roads and bridges. We have a federal partner. It's not 100% state money. It never has. So in this particular case, and I'd be curious to know what states are doing it right so we can model them, Senator Osmek. But certainly like to know from a practical application of this bill that would be, in fact, what we've been doing, not being able to leverage those dollars for these projects. I just don't see any other way for us to afford them.
I'm going to go to Ms. Stengel to respond to the question regarding the new starts. Ms. Stengel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. The language that's being stricken here doesn't have any effect on seeking future FTA New Starts program. Again, so merely referencing that was how Southwest was identified. So if you read it all together, it's basically saying the project that was receiving New Start money. So this doesn't have anything to do with any other projects or the ability of Southwest to continue federal funding or the ability for Met Council to ask for money through the New Starts program in the future.
Mr. Shetland, did you want to weigh in on this question also?
I would, just to add just a little bit more. Thank you, Mr. Chair. While it does not impact the council's ability to seek New Starts dollars, by saying that there are no state funds going into LRT, current state law says that 50% of the operating funds come from the state. And so by making that shift in our financial capacity report that we do related to Botno, we wouldn't be able to explain where the other 50% of the operations are coming from when current statute says it comes from the state. So that would make it difficult for us to apply out of that New Starts program for a future line, in particular for Botno.
So, Mr. Chair, and I hope this is my last question, what would be the cost of that change for the state?
Mr. Shetland?
Well, Mr. Chair, members, the costs are the state, well, I got to figure out.
Or the loss, basically the loss, Mr.
Senator
Chair.
Franzen? Yep. Senator Franzen?
Mr. Chair, I'm just trying to rephrase the question.
Go ahead.
It would be the loss for the state of all the investments already in Botno if we're not going to be able to bring those New Starts. And if I'm mistaken how this works, please correct me. But there's projects that are already in the pipeline.
Absolutely.
That this bill would impact.
Yep.
And it would have an impact on the ability to bring in those federal New Start dollars to complete those projects that we've already invested to the tune of, and that's my question, how much have we invested that we'd be probably leaving on the table in Minnesota, and taxpayers just throwing money for and seeing nothing in return in terms of transit improvements?
Well, Mr. Chair and Senator Franzen, the 50% share from the feds, it would be nearly $1 billion for the Southwest line. And so the state so far in the Botno line has invested $1 million. That happened, I believe, in the 2013 or 2014 bonding bill. As far as what has been invested into that line at the local level, most of that has been done by Hennepin County, and so, or through CTIB. So I guess I'd prefer to let them speak to that. But what you would be missing out on is the ability to ask for those federal dollars. I mean, which are 50% share from the southwest line, it's $1 billion, and I would guess on the Botano line, by the time it's ready to go, it'll probably be in that same range.
Senator Osmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know Senator Franson and I disagree on this point. We agree on other points. She just signed some jackets on a different bill. My reaction to your commentary is, if you're digging a hole, it's better to take one shovel than to dig all the way to China. And my opinion is, let's not dig the hole that the taxpayer has to fill in all the way to China. If we're going to take a loss, then take a small loss rather than a big loss. So that's my opinion, and we don't agree on this one.
Senator Franson, I didn't mean to interrupt. Do you have any further questions? Senator Friends.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Mr. Shetman. He wants you.
Yes.
Are there any other metropolitan areas in this country trying to prevent the receipt of federal funds for light rail?
Mr. Shetman.
Mr. Chair and Senator Frentz, I can't speak on behalf of all the metro areas, but I know that the regions that are purposefully seeking those dollars, I don't think that they are trying to find a way to not seek those. However, I also want to add that I don't know what their legislatures are doing regarding that as well. So I have a really hard time answering that question, to be honest with you.
Senator Friends, it'd be interesting to watch you lay the foundation to ask for that opinion. Senator Friends.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just a follow-up then might be better phrased. Do you know of any metropolitan areas or legislatures that have taken steps to prevent federal funding for light rail? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Shetman.
Mr. Chair, members, I do not know of any other states that are trying to not allow that to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Shetman. Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad to know that Senator Franzen signed on to an OSMIC bill, and despite the fact that I'm cranky with my neighbor over here, I just signed on to one of his bills. So we just take it issue to issue here. I think everyone's doing a great job of making the points that I was going to make, so I won't make them other than I disagree with this bill. I think it's designed to kill off future LRT. I think the author is clear about that. I support advancing transitways in the metro area. I am curious, though, the definitions, why those are included. Maybe it's a question for council. Do we lack accurate definitions of light rail transit and streetcar? That's one question. Second question is, how is the definition of light rail transit distinct from commuter rail in this definition? So that's probably another question for council. Then my question for Senator Osmik is, why are we defining streetcar? Are we dealing with streetcars in future potential funding for streetcars that may or may not materialize in the metro?
Before we ask Senator Osmik to answer your question, I'm going to ask Ms. Stengel if she would respond to the legal definitions of this, the streetcar, the light rail, and the commuter rail.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Dibble, there are currently no definitions of light rail transit or streetcar in state law, and I will have to get back to you on the difference between light rail transit and commuter rail. At the time I was working on this, there was one, and I don't remember what it is right now.
Senator Osmik, do you have in mind Senator Dibble's question regarding the streetcar? Senator Osmik.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Dibble, if you remember in St. Paul, they were considering putting a light rail line all the way down to West 7th Street to go to the airport. Now they're changing to streetcar, and I don't want the taxpayers on the hook for that one either. Hence, I wanted to include streetcars.
Senator Dibble.
Thank
hence
you.
The definition.
Thank you, Mr. Then maybe I'm not reading the rest of the bill accurately or correctly. Are streetcars captured in the prohibition in the balance of the bill?
Senator Osmik.
Actually, Senator Dibble, they're not, but it does define streetcars. You've now provided me with an amendment that I think I probably need to make. So thank you, Senator Dibble, for bringing that forward.
Mr. Chair, just looking for more opponents to the bill.
One moment. I think I'm going to ask Ms. Stengel to weigh in on this one also.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. The interaction is that for the operating costs and capital costs, you will see that they are specifically for light rail. And when you look at the definition of light rail on the first page, at the end it says light rail does not include streetcars. So by defining operating costs and capital costs just for light rail, by definition it excludes streetcars.
But thank you, Senator Dibble. I'll be making an amendment.
Senator Osbeck. Senator Lang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry about that. I was trying to get it in right after Senator Frentz, and I liked his line of questioning, but it posed a question in my mind. How many other metropolitan areas have a metropolitan council that have taxing authority and regulate such businesses as light rail?
Mr. Shetna.
Well, Mr. Chair and Senator, there are
zero.
Well, the council has many functions, and the one function that you probably hear about the most is the council's role, at least in this committee, is our role as the MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is where federal funds are dispersed through the through those areas. And the council serves as the MPO in the metro area, but the council also has other authorities related to land use planning, to operating the wastewater utility, to do the planning and working with the implementing agencies related to the parks. We have a housing and redevelopment authority. So the council is unique when you look at our work, if you want to isolate it to the work of the MPOs. And so there are, I guess Portland would probably be something similar. In Denver, there's a council of governments. But as far as the MPO function, the council is a bit unique because the council does not have elected officials that serve on them, which is, we spent some time this morning talking about that in Senator Hall's committee with a number of the members on this committee as well. But again, the issue with the council being having more statutory responsibilities makes us that much different, but it also allows us to do long-range planning where we can look at housing, wastewater, transportation, and all these functions together. And I think that is what the legislature had in mind when they gave the council that statutory authority over the last 50 years.
Right.
Follow-up question, Senator.
And thank you, Senator, Mr. Chair. And I think the point I was trying to make here was that as we wade through the way that we try to deal with Metropolitan Council and your taxing authority and the power that you have to oversee things like light rail and how we respond legislatively, I think it's an important thing that we sit here and have this discussion now. So,
Mr. Shedden?
Mr. Chair and Senator Lang, happy to talk to you about that. I think it's important for people to kind of understand the council in whole cloth. Oftentimes we get separated by the different committees, but the council is a big organization, and I'd be happy to talk to you and any other members about that at any point.
Senator Osment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Lang, I think the way to go to talk through this one is actually we are the only Metropolitan Governance Council that does not have elected officials sitting on it making decisions such as this, spending $2 billion per line without any legislative action or authority. That's my problem here. I think we should be in some way accountable for it. And if they're going to do this without our authority and without our approval, then we shouldn't be putting the taxpayers on the hook.
Senator Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my reaction to this is, and I did also just sign on to that bill, so you know we have things we agree on. I think we're finding this session that we're finding more and more that we agree on. But
like last week, we had an agreement too.
Absolutely. This one, I think we're going to part company, and I know you well enough, Senator Osmek, that I'm not going to try to persuade you that you're wrong, but I will raise a couple of concerns with this approach. And part of it is, and it reminds me a little bit about the Senator Senjum's bill with the Stone Arch Bridge. You know, if we want to have some concerns and make some changes in the way things are done, fine. That's certainly our prerogative. I get concerned on two counts. One is I feel like this approach feels a little arbitrary. I mean, if we're just going to say light rail is inherently makes no sense, which is sort of what I hear you saying. It feels like if we're going to do this, there ought to be some more concrete criteria for making those sorts of determinations, just than basing it on a particular method of transportation. So I throw that out there as one concern with the way this is structured. And then the other major concern I have with this is ultimately it's pitting parts of our state against each other. And it reminds me in ways of conversations that we've had over the years, largely because we don't have enough resources in our entire transportation infrastructure. So I'm reminded last year when we were nitpicking the math of how we divide up metro versus non-metro funding for corridors of commerce and that percentage. Or over the years, Senator Carlson has tried to propose street improvement districts as a way to let our local units of government make some important changes. And it's creative because we don't have enough funds going through to our local units of government. And ultimately, you know, I and others believe that strong transit in the metro is good for the metro, which is good for the whole state. And when we start picking at different elements, if we want to point to different aspects of transit that aren't very efficient, as one would define that, for example, the suburban opt-outs, you know, those are pretty highly subsidized. Should we start going after those? You know, no. We have a system that works with different components for many different reasons, and to come back and start saying, I don't like this, therefore I'm going to take this away from you, that I think is just not healthy in the big picture for how we manage our infrastructure within our state. And so I'm sure you have a difference of opinion, and I look forward to hearing it.
Well, Mr. Chair, briefly.
Senator Osmick, I see no further questions, so I'll give you an opportunity to respond to Senator Kent, and then your final comments before we lay this bill over.
Well, Senator Kent, yes, we will disagree on this one. If at any point in time before we actually started down the path of the Southwest line, had an honest-to-goodness discussion, we have never had that in my 7 years tenure here at the legislature. We have had an informational that was slapped into the end of a transportation meeting that was 10 minutes of discussion, but no real true discussion on the actual cost of that line. My concern here is focusing resources on a very inefficient method as opposed to putting it into methods that I believe are more efficient. They may not be terribly efficient, but I have been a very big proponent of bus rapid transit. I've written on the A line, and I'm looking forward to some of these circular cutoff lines that make sense, as well as any additional rapid in and out rapid transit. The Southwest Transit buses are always full when I'm driving down the freeway. So if we had had that discussion, maybe we wouldn't be having this discussion today. And my discussion on how much it costs includes the build-out costs, which is something that Met Council will never include in their financial projections, that they don't include the capital cost of building the line itself. They think that they exclude that because that's money that falls off of a tree someplace. It's not true. It needs to be, if a city builds a water tower, you have to account for the water tower, not just the pump and the water that goes through it. So we are going to have a difference of opinion. Last Wednesday, we were both snickering at the same time because we both agreed on something. But I think that's why we're here, is to have that logical discussion. So with that, members, I appreciate the discussion. I know that there's people in the room that think that light rail is the right thing to do. I don't think it is, just based on the numbers. And I appreciate the time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Osmick. With that, Senate File 1148 is laid over. There is no further business before the committee, and we are adjourned.